my task, I think, is to introduce you to Chesterton and, in a sense, his orbit. I want to begin with a quote. Conversion is like stepping across the chimney piece out of a looking glass world where everything is an absurd caricature into the real world God made, and then begins the delicious process of exploring it limitlessly. This was a statement Evelyn Waugh made to Edward Sackville West on hearing about a friend coming to know Christ. Conversion. Conversion is like stepping across the chimney piece out of a looking glass world where everything is an absurd caricature into the real world God made. And then begins the delicious process of exploring it limitlessly. I think this gets at the heart of Chesterton, a man who in his adulthood comes to know Christ. And he could have written this line. He began to explore the world, and it was a delicious process. I set this up because I think it will help us see what this journalist from Fleet Street actually achieved. And I want to juxtapose this to a statement that Virginia Woolf shared with her sister in a letter after T.S. Eliot came and told her that he had become a believer. This is what she wrote to her sister. I've had the most shameful and distressing interview with poor dear Tom Eliot, who may be called dead to us from this day forward. He has become an Anglo-Catholic, believes in God and immortality, and he goes to church. I was really shocked. A corpse would seem more credible than he is. I mean, there's something obscene in a living person sitting by the fire believing in God. Now, this is what Chesterton was up against near the time he came to faith. This was 1928 that Virginia Woolf penned this. And in fact, the historian Adrian Hastings observed that in the 1920s, in the principal intellectual or distinct from social orthodoxy of England in the 1920s was no longer Protestantism, nor was it Catholicism, little c, or any other form of Christianity. It was a confident agnosticism. To believe meant standing out against every single one of the giants of modernity. The prophets who had established the framework of understanding wherein intellectual discourse took place. The whole modern civilization of the mind seemed now established in this. The 1920s, as a consequence, were the first decade in which the overturning of Christianity, effectively achieved by the previous generation, could be and was openly accepted as a fact of modern life. Broadly speaking, the church's response at this time is what I would depict as a siege mentality. They weren't quite sure what to do. And it's almost as if they had run back across the moat, drew up the drawbridge, and were sort of looking out at what was happening. And this guy, G.K. Chesterton, says, enough of this, blows down the bridge and walks out into British society and lets him have it. Dorothy Sayers provides us with an apt description of this state of things in a tribute she gave to the enormously potent Christian presence of Chesterton at this time. She says, and again, this is just a marvelous bit of writing. Sayers is amazing. To the young people of my generation, GKC was a kind of Christian liberator. Like a beneficent bomb, he blew out of the church a quantity of stained glass of a very poor period, and he let in gusts of fresh air in which the dead leaves of doctrine danced with all the indecorum of Our Lady's tumbler. I'll insert, it took me 2 years to track down this little reference to Our Lady's tumbler. It actually comes from a 12th century medieval tale about a monk who was inept at everything, didn't fit anything in terms of the community and what it did, but he was a great tumbler. Like gymnastics. And so he'd sneak away into the side chapel dedicated to Mary, and he would tumble before Mary and the Lord as his devotion. And the abbot finds him out. And he's a wise abbot. And he says, my brother, if this is what God has given to you, then share with the whole community. So they would gather. So all the indecorum of Our Lady's tumbler. And that was Chesterton. She goes on and she says, no doubt in her substance, the church was then as ever glorious and immutable. But she was at the beginning of the century somewhat unfortunate in her accidental presentation, seeming to the man on the street to offer little choice except between a somewhat complacent Protestant morality and a rather simpering Catholic piety. Christians were felt to be somewhat in the position of death watch beetles, chewing their blind way through rotten timbers that were due to come down with the building. It was therefore, note this, and she's referring to Chesterton now, it was therefore stimulating to be told that Christianity was not a dull thing, but a gay thing. Now this dates this, obviously. Not a dull thing, but a gay thing, not a stick in the mud thing, but an adventurous thing. Not an unintelligent thing, but a wise thing, and indeed a shrewd thing. And above all, it was refreshing to see Christian polemic conducted with offensive rather than defensive weapons. Lewis's tribute, at a time when he's trying to find somewhere to hide and insulate himself from the claims of the gospel, and he's not faring too well, he says, then I read Chesterton's Everlasting Man, and for the first time saw the whole Christian outline of history set out in a form that seemed to me to make sense. Somehow I contrived not to be too badly shaken. You will remember that I had already thought Chesterton the most sensible man alive apart from his Christianity. Now I veritably believe I thought, I didn't of course say, words would have revealed the nonsense, that Christianity itself was very sensible apart from its Christianity. What I'm trying to show is Chesterton's shadow that's being cast during this period of time. And Tolkien, even though Tolkien does not refer to Chesterton here, one of the things Chesterton's Everlasting Man did was revitalize the whole Eden story. And this is a letter that Tolkien wrote to his son Christopher. As for Eden, I think most Christians, except the very simple and the uneducated or those protected on other ways, have been rather bustled and hustled now for some generations by the self-styled scientists. And they've sort of tucked Genesis into a lumber room of their mind as not very fashionable furniture. A bit ashamed to have it about the house, don't you know, when the bright, clever young people call. I mean, of course, even the Fidelius, who did not sell it secondhand or burn it as soon as modern taste began to sneer. In consequence, they have indeed, myself as much as any, as you say, forgotten the beauty of the matter even as a story. But partly as a development of my own thought on my lines and work, technical and literary, partly in contact with C.S. Lewis, and he's referring here to Lewis's essay, Myth Became Fact, and much of what's in that essay Lewis got from Chesterton. And he says, and in various ways, not the least the firm guiding hand of alma mater ecclesia, I do not now feel either ashamed or dubious on the Eden myth. It has not, of course, historicity of the same kind as the New Testament, which are virtually contemporary documents, while Genesis is separated by we do not know how many sad exiled generations from the fall. But certainly, there was an Eden on this very unhappy earth. We all long for it, and we are constantly glimpsing it. Our whole nature, at its best and least corrupted, its gentlest and most humane, is still soaked with a sense of exile. As far as we can go back, the nobler part of the human mind is filled with thoughts of Sib, peace, and goodwill, and with the thought of its loss. Again, Chesterton is the one who paved the way. Now what I want to do is I want to take a little bit of time, because most of you, I don't think, know much about this man, Chesterton. And what I've done is I've kind of edited down a personal tribute that I wrote up for Chesterton. And so not only has he influenced these authors that you're going to be exposed to later on, coming up here at Table Talks, but I want you to see that he works his magic today, and he worked it on me. I owe a great deal to G.K. Chesterton. Perhaps more than any author I've read, G.K. Chesterton has succeeded in becoming a real person in my life. He enchants me, he frustrates me, he inspires me, he deflates me. He sets me wondering, how can he be so incredibly insightful? How can he be so far afield? That's brilliant. Whoa, that's absurd. That's simply wonderful. Sometimes I'm not altogether sure I know what he means, but more often than not, it is wonderful all the same. Sometimes he makes me laugh till my sides ache. Other times he frightens me. And still at other times he makes me feel as if everything is really and truly all right. Change a few things, and this describes my wife. And I mean that in a good sense. Chesterton was born in 1874 into a comfortably placed family in London. The family was not particularly religious and seldom went to church. And following his formal education, he attended for a time the Slade School of Art at the University College London, eventually moving into a career of journalism, which he sustained till the end of his life. He wrote 100 books and made contributions to over 200 more. He wrote hundreds of poems, 5 plays, 5 novels, and some 200 short stories, including a popular series featuring the priest detective Father Brown. As a journalist, he wrote over 5,000 newspaper essays, including 30 years' worth of weekly columns for the Illustrated London News and 13 years of weekly columns for the Daily News. He also edited his own newspaper called GK's Weekly. I think the guy wrote in his sleep. He was an imposing figure. He stood 6'4" and weighed about 300 pounds. He typically had a cigar in his mouth, walked around wearing a cape and a crumpled hat and tiny glasses on the end of his nose, and carried a sword stick in his hand. He was quite the sight on Fleet Street. Perhaps the Catholic apologist, Bible translator Ronald Knox captured as well as anyone the heart of the man and his importance when he observed that Chesterton, quote, had the artist's eye which could suddenly see in some quite familiar object a new value. He had the poet's intuition which could suddenly detect in the tritest of phrases a wealth of new meanings and of possibilities. But the most salient quality, Knox noted, was his gift of illuminating the ordinary, of finding in some trivial a type of the eternal. And I personally would want to add that his writing tends to make one better, wiser, and perhaps most of all, important of all, happier and merrier. He certainly has done that for me. Oh, here we go. Printed on both sides. So what do I owe to Chesterton? He helped heal me from a nasty case of cynicism by re-enchanting my world, and he managed to do it with just 6 little words. 6 words that burst off the page and into my imagination. Words that were full of a wealth of new meanings and of possibilities. And I first encountered them in December 1995. The phrase comes at the end of the middle stanza of a poem called The Truce of Christmas. And this is the stanza. The idle, humble hill and wood are bowed upon the sacred birth, and for one little hour the earth is lazy with the love of good. Lazy with the love of good. It's a phrase both simple and it's eloquent and elegant. With an ease that may cause the reader to miss the significance, Chesterton transforms our notion of a vice into a virtue, turning lazy into a posture supremely suited to the good. Chesterton's lazy is a virtue for at least two reasons. First, it guards the integrity of the good. That is, it recognizes that good is worthy of our undivided attention or involvement. It carries with it the idea of being able to give oneself to something or someone for its own sake, without thought of utility. Secondly, it denotes freedom. It calls attention to the human capacity to be able to bring our entire attention and focus to the moment. The freedom of an undistracted moment, a moment of complete attentiveness, to be lazy with my children as we play and we talk, and now with my grandchildren. To be lazy with my life, my friends, my work, my world. With this turn of phrase, Chesterton captured my imagination, communicating a sense of pure pleasure and delight, unrestrained, undistracted. It was also an experience of longing, a longing for the day of small things, the days of contentment. In my childhood, I knew it and experienced it often, sitting by the hour hidden away in the best cherry tree in my neighborhood, experiencing unhurriedly its sweet pleasures. I used to actually sit up there and look down and knew nobody could see me up there as they walked underneath. Lying on my back in a nearby meadow where the tall grass hid everything from view but the blue sky above. And there I gave myself unreservedly to the moment of endless blue framed by the green grass that pillowed my head. But childhood is short-lived, and a call to grow up soon followed. My first premonitions of that other world arose during the tumultuous period of life we call adolescence, that no man's land of transition from simple childhood to the rough and tumble world of adulthood. Like every other child, I wanted to grow up. And like every other child, I was expected to do so. From now on, those wonderful moments of lazy were to be viewed as merely self-indulgent, wasteful, and more importantly, non-productive. And yet I knew, somehow I knew, that things would never be the same, and that by moving up, I was losing something vital to what it means to be alive. Under the pressures of growing up, such idle love of the simple and the mundane was no longer appropriate. A tiny bit of life was being taken away. Oh, but the longing remained, hidden and buried under 101 things to do, to be, to achieve, acquire, be gained. And I'm again left wondering whether this is not in part of the pain and disillusionment of adolescence. A.A. Milne, any Winnie the Pooh fans here? Captures well this when Christopher Robin, facing the thought of having to grow up, struggles to find a way of saying goodbye to his good friend Pooh. Then suddenly again, Christopher Robin was still looking at the world with his chin in his hands, and he called out to Pooh. "Yes," said Pooh. When Pooh, yes, Christopher Robin? I'm not going to be doing nothing anymore. Never again? Well, not so much. They won't let you. All too few, I fear, are today able to enter into and share in the experience these words seek to convey. This is due in part to the kind of world in which we live, or more particularly to the culture we contend with each day. It is a driven world, and at times insanely so. It is a world of people like us, caught up in a desperate attempt to make something of ourselves. And I remember returning to the States from India in 1981, ill-prepared for the shock that was awaiting me. Compared to what I'd become accustomed to in India, the pace of life was alienating. In this world, Chesterton's ideas of lazy and the love of good rarely find a place to exist, let alone flourish. Now, what Chesterton is saying here. What Chesterton is advocating, in other words, is the wonderful skill of being lazy with the love of real things, not merely their ideal constructs. He's declaring that Christian love, the love that our Lord demonstrated, is able to encompass the beauty of Pachelbel's canon in D major, as well as the runny nose of our neighbor. This idea of the real and the concrete directs us to Chesterton's idea of the good as well. Good, says Chesterton, like love, is not an idea, it is a thing, real and concrete. Quote, what represents good in this world, he declares, must be first concrete and second compact. The idealists and the professors of abstractions can never understand it being concrete, and the imperialists and greedy megalomaniacs can never understand it being compact. The good is a thing, not a theory. And Chesterton honestly believed in the good, and he believed that it was the final destiny of human souls. But he was not convinced that others shared his opinion on the matter. And he raises this point in his novel Man Alive. In defense of its main protagonist, Innocent Smith's extravagant escapades, the character Michael explains. It will then be asked, why does Innocent Smith continue far into middle age, a farcical existence that exposes him to so many false charges? I have a very simple answer to that, though it is one that will not be approved. There's but one answer, and I'm sorry if you don't like it. If Innocent is happy, it is because he is innocent. If he can defy the conventions, it's just because he can keep the commandments. Speaking singularly, Michael goes on to say, I feel as if man was tied to tragedy, and there was no way out of the trap of old age and doubt. But if there is a way out, then by Christ and St. Patrick, this is the way out. If one could keep as happy as a child or a dog, it would be by being innocent as a child or as sinless as a dog. Barely and brutally to be good. That may be the road, and he may have found it. Well, I see the look of skepticism on the face of my old friend Moses. Mr. Gould does not believe that being perfectly good in all respects would make a man marry. No, said Gould, with an unusual and convincing gravity. I do not believe that being perfectly good in all respects would make a man marry. Well, said Michael quietly, will you tell me one thing? Which one of us has ever tried it? Now here's a question I, for one, had never really entertained. Can being perfectly good, being holy, keeping all the laws of God in all respects make a person truly merry, happy, and full of joy? The answer our faith gives us is a resounding yes. 1 Thessalonians 4:3, for this is the will of God, your sanctification. That is, being made holy. And Paul, in Philippians, that book about joy, says, finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is anything excellent, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and God, the God of peace, will be with you. But do I really believe this? That is the question Chesterton would have us ask, and to ask it in a serious way. For my part, and for what it's worth, my answer is that I'm not convinced that we do. For the evidence appears to indicate that at the end of the day, we don't. Rather, the best of all possible worlds is to remain within this twilight existence where we mix the good with a little bad. Pure and unadulterated goodness leaves us yawning. And the question I've come to use to test my heart in these matters is simply this: what am I entertained by, and what am I bored by? That's a distillation of some of Chesterton's work on me. Am I bored with the good? And if I am, then I must confess that at some level I really do not yet believe, as I should, what my faith actually proclaims. That Jesus Christ came down to make us completely holy, pure, and innocent. And in order that we might enter into his joy. And that our joy might be made complete in his goodness. Chesterton once described this idea using the activity of play. It is not only possible to say a great deal in praise of play, it is possible to say the highest things in praise of it. It might reasonably be maintained that the true object of all human life is play. Earth is a task garden. Heaven is a playground. To be at last in such secure innocence, that is, goodness, that one can juggle with the universe and the stars. To be so good that one can treat everything as a joke, that may be and perhaps is the real end and final holiday of human souls. Perhaps our anemic sense of the good is one reason why heaven so often holds little attraction for us. For heaven is nothing more and nothing less than the eternal state of being lazy with the love of good. Perhaps Lewis was right. Chesterton certainly indicates that he would have agreed with Lewis when he stated in his sermon, The Weight of Glory, indeed, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday by the sea. We are far too easily pleased. Ultimately, as the context of Christmas suggests, in this, The Truce of Christmas, the title of the poem, Chesterton invites us to be lazy with the love of Christ. And here I'm reminded of Mary, who experienced just such virtuous indolence when she sat at the feet of Jesus. Free to be lazy, she gave herself completely to the good, with no thought or sense of how this moment was to be related to the moments that followed. She was not looking to achieve any other end, nor was she looking to move on to something else. At that moment, there was no other end, and there was nothing else. With these 6 words, Chesterton offered me and offers us, I believe, a better way. Better, not necessarily easier. For as Chesterton reminds us, the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried. So that was my, this is going to work out well, tribute to Chesterton, the man. And I think it gives you a little flavor of what he does in various ways. One example in terms of sort of being incredibly uplifted and blessed and yet confused at the same time was my first experience with his novel, The Man Who Was Thursday. Anybody here read that? Okay, there's a few. I don't know about your experience, but this is what I did when I finished it, and literally out loud. I was all by myself, but I closed this book and I went, whoa, that was amazing. I have no idea what it's about, but whoa, is that a ride. I knew something happened. I wasn't quite sure what it was. Now see, here's the other thing about Chesterton and what he's trying to do. Unlike Lewis takes his project and he actually moves it from planet Earth to re-enchant our understanding of the supernatural and the afterlife. What Chesterton's trying to do is re-enchant the world around us that had become grim and meaningless. And he says the problem is seeing, the ability to see. He says if he had a university, the object of my school is to show how many extraordinary things even a lazy and ordinary man may see if he can spur himself to the single activity of seeing. But because we have an habitual way of looking at things, we no longer see them anymore. So if you have a hard time with Chesterton, he's just as a little too quirky for you, well, it's actually intentional. What he's doing, the way I describe it, is we all look at it this way. He goes over half a degree and just looks at the same thing with his little quirky angle. And some people struggle. But if you persevere, at the end of that is potentially this aha moment. It's like, oh. And the people who followed him and achieved it in brilliant ways were Tolkien and Lewis. For those of you who know Tolkien's work, for example, you go into Middle-earth and you're exposed with all these things. And one of the things you're exposed to there are trees. Now, you probably have never really thought seriously about a tree. But no longer. You come out of that book and you start looking at trees and it's like you've never seen them before. And you go, yeah, beeches kind of, whoa, and oaks and willows, and they become real living things. You don't come out a world despiser from Middle-earth. You come out with your world re-enchanted. That's the magic of Chesterton. And that spell he cast on his generation. And most of the benefit we get from Chesterton doesn't come from Chesterton anymore. It comes through these people whom he influenced and impacted. I mean, he's the one that said, the reason the fairy tales talk about trees that grow apples made of gold is to remind us that we live in a real world with real trees that grow real apples of gold and red and green, and a real apple is far more enchanting than a gold apple, a make-believe gold apple. But we don't see it. MacDonald used the word awakening. Chesterton's word is seeing. Tolkien picks it up, it's recovery, to recover things. Chesterton say, we recover by beginning to see them rightly. Well, I think I'll stop there. What I want to do is just sort of draw you into Chesterton's world by drawing you into my world with him and a little bit more. Well, I should just, one of the things in terms of makes sense, when Lewis says through Chesterton, he began to see the Christian view of history in a way that made sense. This reading that I suggested, Christianity and Rationalism, basically what Chesterton does is, right at that time, especially with James Frazer, the Golden Bough, and things like that, during this period of time, it's saying the notion that you have these themes of a dying God, a God sacrificing himself throughout, mythical literature, works against the particularity of Christianity. So they just say it's just one of many, and Frazer especially then reduces it down to just explanation from the empirical world. But Chesterton says, well, yeah, but if you look along the beam, and that's Meditations in a Tool Shed, not just looking at it, but come inside the story and look along it, what you see is exactly what we would expect. Basically saying, okay, if Christianity is true, then there's this fall and humanity dies. And they're exiled out of the garden. But they come out of the garden with an understanding of how it all began. They come out of the garden with this promise in Genesis 3:15 that one day Satan's going to get his comeuppance. Another offspring is going to come and bash his head in, basically. And if that's true, if humanity comes out of the garden with this promise of some kind of future redemption, then shouldn't we expect that showing up all over the place? And the further you move away from it, it sort of, takes on new forms. Kind of like if I start with Rick and say something and it goes through the room and, a little bit it's left, but he says that's it. Now, if it's not out there, then Christianity is false. We would expect rumors coming out of there. But the other thing we would expect, that at some point it would actually happen. And he says it does. in this little piece of real estate in Palestine when Quirinius was governor. It was just as specific as that. God entered in, sacrificed himself, died for us. He says it all makes sense. This is exactly what we should expect. And for Lewis, what this did for him, because at this stage there was this bifurcation had gone on inside of him. So over here is all the rational part. And it's all materialism and what he called atoms and evolution. And it was grim and it was meaningless, it was ugly. But everything that he considered was beautiful lived in this other sphere that he could not accept as real. Because materialism basically denied that as a reality. And what Christianity did is it healed that wound and brought those two things together. And what he realized is that his experiences with mythology, which he loved, there was a reason for it. Because they actually participated at some level in the truth. And it was that truth that was seeking to get at him through those. But that truth becomes clear in the gospel. So, yeah, you might know that Tolkien just thought that the Chronicles of Narnia were just baldered out. He hated them. He thought it was just trash. And part of it is because he was a purist and Lewis mixed and matched all these mythical creatures together. And he says, you just don't do that. Well, maybe I'll get a chance to talk to them about this at some point, but I think it's Tolkien's fault. Because what Tolkien helped him see, and it was Tolkien and this guy named Dyson who helped heal this wound, is that, again, his experience with myth was validated at a level. It's not altogether without some truth and some benefit. So what does he do at the end of Prince Caspian? He brings them all together, and it's like jollification. And they all are jumping around Aslan. Why? Because they all find their fulfillment in Christ. All the myths partake in some level. And he's just playing that idea out. And he thinks it's great fun. Tolkien just seemed to think it was bad form. Anyway, well, thank you. Yeah.
So questions, comments for Chris? One quick question I have, Chris. One of the things that seemed to be kind of bullseye, particularly for Chesterton, but also for some of the other guys, is concerns of modernism. We live in a world of, quote, postmodernism. I'm just wondering what lessons that you might see from their response to their world that we might see in response to ours.
Right. I think there's one real critical one, and it also bears witness of why they're not just left on a shelf, they're still, in a sense, making news, is because they didn't bow the knee to either modernism or what we call postmodernism. It's all reason or all imagination. For them, we're both a rational and imaginative being, and therefore they're constantly using both of them and bringing them together. And that's the great appeal by these authors. I mean, you move to this sort of lack of imagination in the way that we're talking about, even supernaturalism and modernity, and then they say, oh no, let's throw out reason, nobody's going to listen to it, let's just do imagination and story. But if you look at their stories, it's all rational. In fact, Tolkien in On Fairy Stories says, nothing's more rational than fairy tales. You take out reason and the whole thing collapses. So it was the idea of wedding the two and keeping them together. So, for example, for those, because I think many of you are familiar with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I mean, right in the first third of the book. I mean, it's just so cheeky of Lewis. It's great, though. It's when Peter and Susan are fit to be tied. They don't know what to do with Lucy. They think she's losing her mind. They don't know what to do, so they go to the professor. And the professor basically takes them through a school of logic. But what this logical development opens up is the thought that there really could be something outside the material world. And if you go back and look at this, the kids are saying, wow, they've never heard an adult talk like this. I mean, it's like they've never heard this. And where does it end? Peter going, you mean to tell me there could be other worlds right around the corner just like that? And the professor says, well, yeah, what are they teaching them at these schools these days? Lewis knew, and he's pushing back. Same with Puddleglum, right in the middle of the silver chair. In this imaginative context, he plays out modernity in some ways with Puddleglum's argument against the Green Lady. They're always tied together. You go through Mere Christianity, the reason you keep moving in that book is because of the metaphors and the images, constantly appealing to the imagination. And Lewis divided them this way. He says that reason is the natural organ of truth, and imagination is the natural organ of meaning. And you need both of them. So I'd say that's the biggest thing. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We're imaginative, rational creatures, and we need to have that project always together. Yes?
My question is just, where do I begin? Where should I start with Chesterton? Having not read him before.
Well, I mean, if you want to get into right to the center of him, orthodoxy, it's not an easy read. It's profound in areas, baffling in some areas, but it really, in many ways, Chesterton says that's where he tried to put it together. It came as a result of a book just before it was called Heretics. And he basically goes and he schools of thought and people. He's saying, they're heretics, this is why. George Bernard Shaw was one of the heretics, his buddy, and he's got a chapter to why he's a heretic. So then when it was done, they said, okay, we know what you don't believe, what do you believe? And orthodoxy was the response to that. Father Brown stories would take you into some of the way he plays out imaginatively these things. That would be a good place. And then his essays. I mean, any of his collections of essays. I mean, he has it on everything. Cheese. You know, I mean, you all are, if you don't love cheese, then you're all lesser mortals. And it'll be fixed when you get to heaven. He's got one on lying in bed, the virtues of lying in bed. And he says the only drawback is they haven't made a pencil long enough where you can lie on your back and doodle on the ceiling. He was a doodler. He was an artist. So, yeah. Any other Chestertonians who would have an idea there in terms of where to begin?
What I found in my pocket.
Ah, yeah, that essay, What I Found in My Pocket. Yeah, he re-enchants the ordinary. Man Alive's my favorite novel.
And one thing about Chesterton is you'll find a ton of his stuff available in public domain. Nowadays you can get it on
Right.
Kindle or get the 99-cent version of it if you
Right.
want someone to put a little effort into formatting.
Yeah.
It's wonderful in terms of the access.
Yeah, and I'll just warn you, it may not be your cup of tea. I mean, Chesterton is quirky. He's got this odd angle. Now, Lewis, the way I view it is Lewis sort of really loved Chesterton, got Chesterton, and somehow his gift was being able to take that quirky angle, but just sort of kind of bring it into focus. We don't have to work quite so hard, in a sense, to get to the end game.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.